Hi, I'm John Atack, and it's been far, far too long since I spoke to Pat Ryan and Joe Kelly. So welcome. I'm starting at the beginning of these things now. I say, look, we're here with quite a lot of experience in the things we're talking about generally. And that means that we're here to teach, but we're also here to learn, because we have not achieved the perfect state of guruhood, any of us yet. And there are things we don't know.
Try as I might, I spent 11 years seeking guruhood. And that was only because I believed that I might be worthy. And then I learned I wasn't.
I could have told you that. If you'd just given me the money, I would have told you you're unworthy.
There was a dollar figure associated with guruhood. And if I'd known that at the outset, I wouldn't have bothered.
It's one of the things I love. Idris Shah. I know there are people who think he was a confidence trickster, but I love the guy. Some of the things he said, and one very wise thing he said is, if somebody tries to charge you money, they're not giving you the truth. In terms of, you know, the religious enlightenment sort of path, and that's one I've used ever since. It's like, how much is it going to cost? Sorry, if it costs me money, you know, I don't believe you have the wisdom. So
interesting thing. That was an interesting thing, because one of the things, at least the group I was involved with, was TM, and Maharishi taught that people didn't value something unless they paid for it.
Yeah,
Westerners were really locked into the materialistic worldview. So therefore, to become spiritual, you had to use material to get there. Makes sense, huh?
Show me the money.
What's been interesting is I've been admitted to some Facebook groups and some other areas of people that were involved in TM at very high levels. And it fills in these gaps of time, of things that when I was involved, I didn't know.
Yeah,
you know, but I know that Maharishi wouldn't be around for some period of time, but you didn't know what was going on. And here are these people who are describing these different periods of time with varying degrees of love for the time, excitement for the time, mourning for the time. But there's a lot of discussion around money. And is it worth charging? You know, do you have to charge someone to learn to meditate? And one of the person said, you know, that when I teach people to meditate outside the TM organization, whatever the fee is, let's say if it's $1,000, I say, as long as you come once a month for checking, every month for 10 months, it'll be $100 less that you have to pay at the end of the 10 months. And he said, and people come and they continue meditating, and there is no relationship between those people. They were saying that paid and didn't pay. But it's all different kinds of views, and it's an odd thing for me, because it brings me back to a time which was both exciting, my youth, transformational, to solve the problems of the world, this idealistic time when we were all pointed on creating an ideal society, stopping wars, and there's something kind of charming and lovely about that.
And not having to dirty your hands in the process. I mean, it was wonderful to sit silently in a room of 1,000 other people and know that you were transforming the world just by your very essence. It's a very powerful place to be when you're 24.
But the thing is interesting when I'm in these different Facebook groups, which there's thousands of people in them, when they talk about the time in the 60s when the Beatles were with Maharishi, through the early 70s when there were large courses in Spain and on Mallorca, until the times it moved into Belgium and Switzerland, just different stages of the TM movement and what people experienced and how it evolved. There's this tendency to draw lines in the sand, that it was good before this point. It was good before this point. It was good back before. He must have got materialistic at this point. And it's so much.
Scientology, you have exactly the same thing. I interviewed people who, you know, like A. Van Vogt, the science fiction writer, brilliant science fiction writer. he got caught up with Hubbard in 1950. He never wrote another word of fiction. And he was still, when I interviewed him in 1984, he was still totally set on doing this original, Dianetic, no past lives sort of stuff. And it was all right up until then. And then you talk with people who'd got in during the 50s, and it was all right until Hubbard went to St. Hill in 1959. Then it was all right until he founded the Sea Organization in 1967. And on and on and on. And then it got crazier that, you know, he'd been driven out of the body in 1952, and the original founder had now come back, and all of, but yeah, there was a golden age, and it used to work then. You know, people really did get clear then. They don't anymore. And that desire to, I remember talking with Ben Corridon, who wrote L. Ron Hubbard, Messiah or Madman, and he himself was a very successful Scientology mission holder. I think his building was worth $2 million, and he had $900,000 in the bank when they came in and took it from him. And he was saying, oh, they were just such great days. And I was saying, you were conning people. You know, but it was fantastic, the camaraderie we felt. So you were conning people, you know. And another one was the head of Scientology's legal, you know, the head of the whole shebang. And a friend invited us to dinner in LA, which he thought was funny because we both lived in the same town in England. You know, thought, oh, I won't tell them that they're. And he said, I had a deal with Michael Flynn for $2 million. If only Norman Starkey had let me sign this deal, it would have all gone away. And I just looked at him and said, yeah, and Scientology wouldn't have collapsed. What are you thinking? You know, but that fondness for, you know,
for the golden era.
Les temps perdus, the times past, yeah.
And I want to just tie this back in. We also find this with the Hare Krishnas, where there's this line drawn in the sand of when Prabhupada, the founder, was alive, and then all the problems happened after. Yep. That's when the guru's heads were cut off, and all the drug dealing happened, and the abuse. There's this arbitrary line.
For anybody watching, there really was a beheading.
Yeah, there was a beheading.
It happened in UK, right? It happened in London.
The second in command of that particular tributary decided that, having been given LSD by the master, he was going to behead him, which seems a pretty severe punishment to me. But obviously, he didn't like the LSD. What can I say? You know?
Well, it seemed like him.
So many groups are like this, where this line is drawn in the sand, and I think
beheading, post beheading.
Yeah, beheading. Yeah. when I'm in this group and I'm reading it, I think back to these very fond times, also. So I think that sometimes that those fond times are a reflection, at least, on the idealism that we had as youth, when we had certainty about whatever it was, and it didn't matter if it was TM or anything else. It's a memory of a time that was transformative, exciting, youthful, and I think that's what people are drawn to in many ways. And then we have the words to fill it in with, and that in this case it's the TM verbiage of what happened, where the Krishnas have a very similar thing, Scientology has a similar thing. I think it's about our youth more than it is about the technologies or whatever practices we did, because at the same time we could muster up all the horrible things that happened, but we tend to focus on that one part. And,
you know, it's interesting.
I've enjoyed the hell out of being allowed into these groups to just to, in some way, just to listen. In fact, one of them the other day, someone said, I know your opinion about this is very different than ours, but you fit the rules of the group, so I think we'll let you in. But if you break any of the rules, we won't. I said, look, I have no problem following the rules that you've set up to just express what you feel. In fact, I taught someone to meditate recently, so it's not a black and white thing for me.
Oh no.
And it's fascinating how different people have sort of the leeway, the permission to criticize in ways that they would never allow me to criticize. And that's okay, but it's still it's an enjoyable thing to reflect upon one's youth and an exciting time. And that's and I'm just wondering, as we age and in our field, so many people are aging, and the TM movement, I'll stop on it. I just came across this document of all the people who had died. They've been documenting, and these are people, I'm 64, so these are people, I was pretty young when I got in, so maybe the people were 5 to 8 years older than I'm maybe on average. And so this person put together this list and then looked at some sociological studies on groups like the Shakers and different, the Amana colony, different groups that had disappeared when people sort of aged out or died.
Well, as the Shakers were celibate, there was a bit of a problem.
There was.
And they were not allowed to adopt orphans anymore. That was the end of it, wasn't it? But,
well, the TMers were also, many of them, celibate at the upper levels.
no.
So, but the leadership that's in charge is from that era, and they're old. And so it's a kind of like, in some sense, a mourning for a time that was wonderful, and not focusing too much on the parts that weren't so great.
And now we've got people like, you know, Stefan Molyneux, who are really boring. You know? But Joe,
the fascinating thing is how someone like Stefan Molyneux can attract a following. It's not unlike the people involved in QAnon. And the fascinating thing is the through line of conviction and experience. For me, my experience was tied to technique.
Yeah.
So when we did certain hypnotic techniques, meditation, chanting, guided imagery, these things made sense to me. Okay, belief comes as a result of having an internal experience unlike anything that you've had up to that point. So the one who offers you that experience and transforms you by virtue of your experience is somebody who then offers you a definition. Here's what you experience. This is you becoming closer to God realization. Do you feel that peace? Do you feel that love? Do you feel that explosion of happiness as you're dissociated from your worries and your problems?
And your bank account drained.
And your bank account drains, no doubt. I spent $4,500 to learn how to levitate in 1977. I was making $160 a week running a vegetarian vendor egg roll truck at Temple University in Philadelphia. I spent every cent to learn to levitate, and then I was certain that I was going to get it. And then I sat on the foam and I hopped around, and I was the first in my small group to hop. And that meant that of the 20 men who I was in the group with, I was the first to actually get up off the foam and plop back down again.
Yes.
Yeah. So when they said, when I went from being a nobody in the group, just an ordinary, you know, shy young guy devoted to meditation, and then I became a superhero overnight, I became really suspicious. That was the moment when I began to realize that there's something really off about this thing, because I didn't feel like anything had changed. Just the fact that I did this physical hopping was the transformation that was expected, and I was suggestible enough to realize it for the group.
I had a very similar experience. I was at St. Hill down south of London, and where the headquarters of Scientology in the UK is. And after 7 years, I had finally crossed through the barrier, and I had done operating Thetan level 3, passed through the wall of fire, learned about Xenu and the body Thetans, and 75 million years ago, and all of this stuff. And I was incredibly unimpressed. I just, what on earth is this stuff? You know, it doesn't seem to have anything, you know, we didn't have anything about entities, about these little indwelling spirits. We weren't taught anything about that until suddenly here's the pink folder. And it just so happened that a friend of mine from Birmingham had come down. And I remember being outside the St. Hill Manor, the Georgian manor house with the cedars of Lebanon, wonderful cedars of Lebanon trees. And he came up to me in a break and he said, "Oh, what's it like? What's it like?" Because he'd come to do exactly the same stuff. And you're stuck in this place where what can you say?
Nothing.
And it just gets worse from there. You've now become a superhuman being in the eyes of those around. But now all you can do is pretend.
Right.
And that was 5 years in to my experience with TM. It lasted 9. But it was a turning point as well. We had to do more and more meditation. So it went from 20 minutes twice a day now to about an hour and a half, 2 hours twice a day. So the commitment was greater and the benefits were less. And so diminishing returns. So we found ourselves, at least I did, with this feeling of emptiness, that the goals and the import of the teaching of creating world peace, it wasn't happening. The people around me
failed, didn't it? You know, I mean, wasn't that through meditation?
Yeah. Stopping. Yeah,
anything that happened that was good was interpreted as a result of meditation.
Yeah,
it didn't matter what it was, including getting parking spaces, and we called it supportive nature. And I remember
car karma. It was
car karma.
good car karma.
Car mechanics, of course.
Supportive nature. And I remember a friend of mine saying, well, I still get parking spaces, so what is that coming from? Is that support Satan? We were just playing with these ideas. But what Joe experienced, and what you experienced, and what I experienced, is these experiences, these internal worlds that were things that we hadn't experienced before, and someone was there to give us a definition of those experiences. And sometimes the person who gives you the verbiage to explain your experience is the person who owns you. They give you the standard for measuring. And that's the one thing that I think that in our work with families whose children are in groups, they're so focused on their kids have been brainwashed, they've been manipulated, they're in a cult, or in all of these things, and they don't grasp the experience someone's had inside of transformation, or that they define as transformation. And so they think of it as totally coming externally. And from my worldview, most people have had these internal experiences, and that's what drives the show. And it's not so much this other stuff. I think that when you have these internal experiences, the fundamental assumption about how the universe works is what switches, and then you fill in all the blanks. They give you the tools to do it, but you do it to yourself.
Yeah, in writing Opening Our Minds, I sent a copy early on to my friend Alex Stein, who's of course a professor of social psychology and has written a couple of wonderful books, Terror, Love and Brainwashing and Inside Out.
Very good.
And she said, why have you described Lifton's 8 deadly sins of thought reform twice? You've got 2 chapters. And the point is that the first chapter says, this is looking at the radicalization of a terrorist through the lens of the 8 deadly sins of thought reform, Lifton's interpretation of the Chinese brainwashing process, so-called. And the next chapter is how we normally induce these 8 states. You don't need somebody from the outside to become involved in, say, the cult of confession to feel the need to tell somebody something. Loaded language is everywhere around us. Doctors, lawyers, any technical situation will have loaded language, which can be justified and necessary, or it can be Latin and a way of making things completely obtuse. And so understanding that we are only ever looking at normal psychological processes, which can then be amplified. And
I think this
is so important, John. I think you raise an important concept here, in that the through line between technique-oriented changing of one's thinking process to today, many of the people who come to us have had no technique.
Yeah.
It's about social media. It's about who they connect with. The information, the limited information that they're exposed to is changing minds in a radical way, with no underpinning of critical thinking or rational thought and understanding of testing ideas. We're lost.
This is something we speak about frequently amongst ourselves, with some of the people who do intervention work, like Joe Zamart, myself, Joe, you, that we look back on our times in the 80s when we were doing interventions, and maybe the early 90s, or there was a template, it was Lifton, and you stamped it and you showed people how it worked. And now those seems to me to be, some of them, we look back and say, oh, that was not exactly right. I was off on this point or off on that point. That those things are maybe tools, concepts that are useful for some people some of the time, but not for all people all of the time. And the idea of trying to make this into a nice little package that has 8 little things, and this is what happened to you, does apply to some people, but not, and if you define it as these 8 things have to exist, then 85% of the people we work with who've been influenced unduly are not in groups because it doesn't apply everyone. And that sort of trying to shove it in is, I think, a mistake. And I think that
that's something I did get from Scientology, because Scientology is all about little lists and hierarchies and models. And I came away with an incredible distrust of any model. And indeed, first looking at Lifton, said, well, these things are not even in the same category.
Right.
You know, the cult of confession, dispensing of existence, it's not a straightforward list. Coming back to the way that he describes it in Destroying the World to Save It, his wonderful book about Aum Shinrikyo, I think where he, for the first time, is really, or early on, is looking at, why are these people using my criteria in the counter-cult world? And he really, being an incredible genius, gives us something. But I don't think he would ever say, well, tick this, you are now in a cult, or something like this. The point is really to look at for me, the fundamental, which is authoritarianism. Am I involved in a relationship where I have no say, where I have no choice, where I'm being directed? And why am I in that relationship? And I think the foundation of that is the transfer of certainty. The feeling, I have a feeling of knowing that you are right. I have a feeling of certainty that you are right. I always come back to the same story. Guy, when I was 17, spent 2 hours trying to talk me into Jesus. At the end, he walked backwards away from me, so I didn't jump on him and attack him, I think. And he said, I don't understand the Bible, but I know it's all true. And this transfer of certainty, this saying, well, I don't know, but this guy seems to, in a world where reality is we're all uncertain, nobody actually has, the answer written down to, there was a guy, he took LSD and he wrote down the answer to all the problems of the universe. He'd realized it while on LSD. And in the morning when he woke up, he was eager to go and read the piece of paper. And what he'd written on the piece of paper was, if I stand on tiptoe, I can touch the ceiling with my finger. So there it all is. You have to meditate on that one for a while.
It is profound. And I could have gotten to that point with just one LSD trip rather than spend 10 years involved in 2 different groups.
Yeah, $5 would have done it.
But certainty, the certainty, I mean, that's a Scientology word. I mean, it's an English word.
It's a word much used. And Hubbard, in fact, said knowledge is certainty. And I always disagreed with that. To me, right from joining, knowledge is uncertainty. Knowledge is, as Socrates and Lao Tzu said, when you know you don't know.
But that concept is something that we talk about with the families we work with, and the way I try to describe it is, the way you know your mother's your mother is not an intellectual process.
Yeah,
I mean, certainly you could go, okay, my parents procreated and and I was born and that's my mother, but that's not what happens. You just know it's your mother, or you know it's your child. You don't go through all of those processes. In that same way, you know something. It's not intellectual. And so there's a text that we use, which is a text used to train physicians to do surgery without any anesthesia. And it's an old training text. And in it, it says the induction of hypnosis is the induction of conviction, of absolute knowingness. It's a line. Induction of hypnosis, induction of conviction, of absolute knowingness. And that's the certainty, and that's the conviction, and that's the way you know your mom's your mom. You just know it. It's not intellectual. And I think that we spend so much time with families trying to get them to wrap their heads just around this one concept, because it's so much easier to pick up a book. And when anybody writes a book, you write books, so many of our friends have written books. I don't think there's a way that you can communicate in the writing the subtlety of what we're talking about. You can create bigger categories, catch categories that you can explain concepts to people, but it's that subtlety that I don't know that people pick up. And it's just
you use the word knowingness there. Did you notice that? Speaking of Scientology, that William James called it Noesis in the Varieties of Religious Experience, that wonderful series of lectures, and that I feel certain about this. And of course, there is a brain condition where people lose certainty or gain a new certainty. So you can have the certainty, for example, that one of your limbs doesn't belong to you. You can have the certainty that you are dead and seek to persuade the people around you that you're dead. You can have the certainty that all of the people you know have been replaced with imposters. That includes your mum and your dad and everybody else. So that mechanism inside, for me, in the human mind, in Lewis Carroll, where the dream, in the dream where you're carrying a baby and the baby suddenly turns into a pig, why don't you in the dream reflect that something extremely strange has just happened? And that, for me, that dream state, that conviction, that powerful conviction, where we don't question the bizarre nature of the events in our dreams, it's quite natural that babies turn into pigs. That exists all the time. It's not something that's just in our dream world. We live, having made a map of the world around us, as I think Immanuel Kant was the first to say, the idea that there's a universe out there and there's the universe as I interpret it. We live in our own interpretation, triggered by particular words, by particular sense, by particular sights. Everybody is living in a personal world. And in that world, there are all sorts of beliefs. And, I had somebody try to explain to me last year that he had no beliefs. And I said, you believe that? It's like, I am such a scientific, materialist, atheist person that, I only see reality. And it's like, no, you only see a very limited amount of reality. A dog, a cat, and a whale are actually far more capable of perceiving the world than you are. And as for eagles, they have 200 times the visual acuity we have. So we see a little bit, we then have the interpretation. And then the interpretive mechanism we have starts up when we're about 4 years old. So before you can understand the world, you're already interpreting it. And round we go. And it might be that the great mystics were actually, the Buddha and people were sharing some way of noticing this about ourselves. But the problem is it seems to collapse as soon as the person teaching it dies and becomes, a religion. So the Buddha, an atheist who said, if their gods were enlightened, they would not be trapped in this universe, becomes the founder of a religion. And let's all get very happy.
Bring up something
3,000, 5,000 years.
About, at the age of 4, at this age, you see that we begin knowing.
Interpretive, yeah.
I just read it.
And
I just read a study yesterday, and it was how children and infants, they were looking at it in models, not human models, but in other models, know who to trust and not trust. One of the factors that
the man who offers you sweets is the one you can't trust, apparently.
Fair, well, sweets, that's how I would trust anyone, is do they exchange saliva? So when animals touch another animal, they're teaching this thing that this is someone who's you can trust or not touch. When a parent shares a spoon, eats off the same thing. And so this is what a study I was reading about, and they were trying to test this theory in animal models. And it was something that's nonverbal, but that somehow a child knows or comes to the conclusion that those people that you're sharing things with, they're the ones that we can trust, and there's the people you don't trust with. You don't do it with strangers.
You've also got the idea of disgust. I don't think, we in our field, we often talk about phobia, induction or indoctrination, guilt induction or indoctrination, but aversion is another aspect of this. And it's kind of, I got very interested in just simply the notion of infatuation, feeling silly about things, becoming fatuous about things. We want to fall in love with stuff. You know, we go onto Amazon and order that thing because we're in love with it. By the time the package arrives, we want to go onto Amazon and order something else, you know, because this feeling of compulsion.
The love is past.
I introduced this to Yuval Noah when I first met him because his model had familial forms of love. And I sort of said, well, what about this love of novelty and this wanting to be in love where all of our perceptions are skewed? At the other end of that spectrum, you have aversion. You have the hatred of things. And disgust is something which, again, seems to come up during possibly the first year of a human life. That initially, you know, that suddenly there are things that you pull away from. And if you look at a group like the Nazis, and we've been talking for long enough that Hitler must be mentioned by now, that is the law, isn't it? If you look at something like that, a lot of what they were doing was arousing aversion, disgust, saying, you know, Jews are covered in lice and those lice carry disease. And therefore the delousing with Zyklon B, that famous myth. And so that parameter of trust being the willingness to exchange saliva, or it's said that there's a study that said that when we shake hands, we surreptitiously smell our hand afterwards. Now, I must say that since I read this study, I've never noticed anybody doing this.
And you've been paying attention.
Yeah, but
yeah,
these cues, these things that we pick up that seem to be so natural, which because of the internet, all of that has changed, that the physical contact is gone. And so maybe the technique is no longer necessary because you can get straight into somebody's thinking.
This is
desires.
And the potency of ideas are spread with no need for saliva, and yet the impact is devastating to families who have a loved one who've been skewed by this new worldview that they feel has taken them away from themselves and away from their previous interests and values.
Yeah.
How does that happen?
Yeah, how is it that a 17-year-old leaves a note on the pillow saying, Mum and Dad, I will never see you again because I love Stefan Molyneux, you know, and I've defooed you.
Yes.
How?
Well, the good thing is we know that most people leave those not loving their parents anymore and come back at some point.
Well, and the bad thing is that we know that a sufficient number of people don't. Even if Eileen Barker's 11% of Moonies going back is a safe study, and I'm not
still a lot of people.
That 1 in 10 is an awful amount of people. That would be, you know, what, 725 million people in the world. And I would also say that people tend to leave one group and join another. So the amount of people who are not influenced by authoritarian practice is tiny. It's tiny. It's just the degree of influence and the strength of it.
Just to go back for when you're talking about diversion, I live in Philadelphia in a when I moved here, it was predominantly Italian neighborhood, and a particular version of it being Italian, and that is for people who immigrated in the late 1800s to the early 1903, 1904, right in there. It was a big migration. And so they came from particular villages before Italian was standardized, and they do things, cook, clean, interact, use verbiage, use concepts as it was then. It's like when they came, time froze, but in their villages now maybe they don't eat pasta every day. Things grew, but
the Amish, the Mennonites.
Yes, it freezes and culture freezes, but there's a term used and it's skeeve, and it's used by the parents to describe things that are not good, mostly around food. So if someone had made a hamburger and it wasn't made the proper way, or spaghetti, you hear, I skeeve that.
And how are we spelling this word?
Schivazza, I think it relates to a real Italian word.
Yeah.
That relates to disgust. And I'm not sure what the translation would be, but the Americanization of it, or the Westernization, is skeeve.
Can you spell it, Joe?
Schiev. I don't know.
It's skeeve.
I mean, yeah, skeeve.
Skeeve.
And so it means disgust.
It means disgust, and it's learned very young of what is acceptable and what's not acceptable. And there's another term that's used culturally that picks up and really like shapes people. And in the term in this dialect where I live is a metagon. And that doesn't mean American. It's a metagon. It relates to another term, but it's especially associated with food. And so
white bread that you would get, not the crusty Italian bread. That would be metagon. That
metagon.
A gravy or a red ragu, if it wasn't properly prepared without garlic and onions or however it was made, that would be metagon because it wouldn't have flavor.
Again, how are we spelling this?
Merican, metagon. It's like American, but it's metagon.
Wonderful.
Now one priest that I know who spent a lot of time in Rome said it relates to another term which indicates testicles, but I'm not exactly sure. Balls, so that tastes like balls. But all that has to be said for a family about going over to someone else's house to eat is a metagon. And that's it. Or
it means the food is tasteless. It has no class. It's not, we'll suffer through it, but it's probably going to be macaroni and cheese or something very bland without any flavoring.
But to Steve also is another term that you as an individual being Irish, you become a non-entity. It means you're dirty, skeeve. It means so many things. It's one term that is taught and enculturated so young that has a huge effect. And so I have friends who are physicians. They grew up in the culture and they'll go, oh, skeeve, and that's it. It's that thought terminating cliche. But it's these examples, I think, that in our world, I think we need to use, that they exist in all levels of society by all kinds of cultures, and they're ways of enculturating people, and they can be maniacal and not maniacal.
It is, I mean, in Scientology, of course, have the degraded being, the suppressive person, the potential trouble source. There are lists of terms of abuse, somebody who is down stat, somebody who is down tone, that these ways of dismissing other human beings. And it's built into culture. I mean, opening our minds, which I published the first edition of it in 2015, but it's actually a little bit of a book that I've been working on called Waking Reason, which I started in 1991.
Wow.
And it should probably never be published, frankly, but what I came to through all of this work was that the senior element was actually enculturation. It wasn't brainwashing or cults, or that any culture is capable of dispensing with the existence of any other culture
easily.
And these things, I'm reading Thomas Schramm who's a moral philosopher, talking about psychopathy. And he's brought together psychologists and philosophers and is saying, well, look, surely all of moral philosophy has been discussing the psychopath from the beginning, from Socrates onwards. What is morality? Are there people who are immoral? Are there people who are amoral? And how should we classify them? Along the side of that, I'm reading a book by which is basically written by a woman who spent 30 years counseling people in Broadmoor Psychiatric Secure Unit, which is our principal hospital for people who have done awful things and who are deemed to be mentally challenged, let's say. And a woman, Gwen Adshead, she puts forward the idea that many of the people she's dealt with are not psychopaths. They're people who situations pushed into doing something awful, and they do feel remorse. And it's not that they're pretending remorse for the parole board, as we all know the psychopath is good at doing. She deals with them over years and finds that And so there seems to be this thing that trauma is not very good for people. Abuse is not very good for people. And creating an authoritarian society which traumatizes and abuses and then labels all around as other, says this is Kiev, this is American, this is not acceptable within our culture, or fixes itself in time, looking at Orthodox Jews, wearing this is something that dates back to what, the 18th century? It doesn't date back to the beginnings of Judaism, that's for sure. No. That, and looking at reading a guy who became a terrorist and went to Syria, born in London, grew up here, and he went there and he found to his shock that the costume that they wear in London with the little round hat and all this is only worn by Christians in Syria.
You're right. Is that further? I mean, I think that idea of enculturation, I mean, we talk about it a lot in our work, and we talk about it as worldviews, cultures as worldviews, and try to teach families how to communicate across these worldviews. You have to understand, I look at the groups as cultures. You got to understand their cultures and its rules in order to be able to communicate across them. But the thing on psychopathy is interesting. I had a long talk with Michael Langoni one time about this. And we were talking about from an evolutionary biological perspective. Why, if we look at DNA, why would that trait be passed on? It seems like it would be a trait that we would get rid of, and but it keeps on coming up over and over again, this trait. And he theorized that there, 150 years ago, 200 years ago, you had a small group of people, a little village or a social group, and you had people coming from the outside that were going to harm you, steal you, take your children away, whatever. That one person who didn't have remorse feelings would just go crazy and go do anything. There was a value. You needed that.
Yeah, the person would be what's called a berserker in this case. And there are studies that question this because such people won't comply with the needs of the village.
Right.
But they're just as likely to kill you as anybody who's coming in. They don't make good soldiers. So
they're self-protective.
Yeah, well, and it is among, I mean, the human predator is my essential subject, and looking at it and going, it's not really important to those of us who are preyed upon what kind of personality we're dealing with, whether it's a malignant narcissist whose parents basically excluded him or her and abused and created this situation, or whether it's the two alleles that are associated with psychopathy and the deficit in the paralimbic connection. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
In terms of proofing people up against responding to them, I think that in evolutionary terms that we need to look more at cultural transmission and symbolic evolution, which is only in the last 20 years really come into the picture, and say that there is these traits are being promoted.
So as you talk about the personality of the individual who is an abuser, a predator, I find it interesting to think back to the guru I was involved with, Swami Prakashanand Saraswati. He started out with a very small group, and in one moment, rare, it only happened once or twice, self-reflection. He said, growing up, I never had a friend.
Yeah.
My only friend was God. And therefore, I'm a model for what you should become. So that became the standard by which we
narcissist. Yeah.
This is perfect. Yeah. Training narcissism, training you to be narcissistic, but only in reference to the people outside of the group. When it came to the group, he encouraged people to give love and devotion, emotional support only to him and to God, his God, which was Krishna, and not be concerned with things like your sexual activities, which was very strange for a group that became very chaste in its later years. When I first joined, he said there's no need to change your sexual habits, but you'll give your emotional life to me, and to God.
Mm.
So be cold and calculating in reference to your physical needs. Just let them go, because they will fall off as you become more spiritual and follow me.
Yeah.
But that created a sense of, I'm invulnerable in the world, and I cannot be hurt, and I can't hurt anyone by disregarding my emotional needs if I give them all over to the guru. It was an interesting twisting of my mindset coming from TM, which was fairly, encouraged celibate marriages and celibacy among single people. And then going to this group where he said, no, don't worry about that. Just love me. Don't love your partner. Don't love your spouse.
Give it to me.
Yeah, exactly. Me.
Yeah.
Well, these are the imposing of someone's experience on other people. And I think we have to be careful of that in all walks of life, where people take their experience in life and say, well, that's what happens to everyone. And I think that I see that, or maybe we all see it in different forms of psychology,
Yes.
where there's a model, and then there's an imposition of that model upon people. Even in our field, this called sort of field, there's models and there's imposition of those models, and they fit with many people, and some people they don't fit. It doesn't mean that the person is not manipulated. They're just not manipulated in that particular way.
And it's being able to teach somebody the model and say, this is a model which you may find useful and will hopefully progress beyond through your understanding. And it is very difficult because it's a long time since I did an intervention, but the frightening part was the end, where the transference happened, where the person would say, what do you believe, John? And I'd have to say, you'll end up in a complete mess if you follow my beliefs. They're crazy. but to actually be, centering on this notion of allowing somebody to become their own authority, which is what the mystic teachings so often say, but they don't do it. L. Ron Hubbard, you will become completely self-determined if you do exactly what I say. You'll be thinking for yourself as long as your thoughts agree with mine. And so that thing of being able to say to somebody, I'm not here to persuade you to leave a group. I'm here to give you information so that you can reconsider your involvement, and you'll decide. And if you carry on, then that's up to you. And, and saying that to parents and, friends, and saying, this is not like a slot machine. You don't put money in, pull a lever, and the person leaves the group. This is about creating a better relationship between you and that person, whether they choose to remain in the group or not.
Well, that's a frightening thing, when in the past, I've been doing this intervention for 38 years, when people would leave so rapidly, they would have these moments, and people that were training us would say, you just say, when they admit they're in a cult, they're out. And I'm like, really? I'm not exactly sure that that's the thing that...
Ryan Siegelman talked about it.
How do you take, in my case, 9 or 10 years of your life and in 2 days say, oh, it's all wrong? It's not. You take a lot of working through those ideas amongst yourselves. But the question that you're asked, and we've obviously, but I think most of us who do this work have been asked that question. And my response frequently has been, I don't understand how we're having this conversation. How did we end up here, two strangers talking and having this sort of intimate discussion? How does that work? That's where I'm stuck. Anything other than that, outside of that, this is pretty amazing. And can we just find happiness that two people can communicate and talk? That's a pretty powerful thing on its own. And that's pretty mystical.
I think that comes to the heart. I've for the last decade, from the age of 17, I sought enlightenment. I went through Scientology seeking it. I carried on afterwards seeking it. And then about 10 years ago, maybe a bit more, I kind of went, I don't want this thing. Because the reason I wanted this was narcissistic. It was because I'd been hurt, and because I didn't want to be hurt again, and I wanted to achieve an equanimity through meditation, through Scientology, through whatever. Now I realize that equanimity may have its uses. In a crisis, I will be the level-headed person who's focused on doing what's what. I will then fall apart afterwards. But what's important, I believe supremely important is relationship, friendship, positive relationship with as many people as you can, or, you know, maybe not as many people as you can, but as many people as you can manage. And therefore, you know, if tragedy and loss strikes me, there will be people I can come to and talk to. You know, there will be people who support me. That individuation, that narcissism, that separating the self out. So I'm invulnerable and I can't be hurt. I'm now the Buddha, or what have you. It's not actually a good process. Let me also say that, you know, we talked at the beginning about, you know, youth and the idealism and the wonder of youth and the strength of one's perceptions as a teenager and an adolescent, all of these wonderful things, the camaraderie, and the idea that the world can be positively changed. And I've gone kind of full circle. I'm certainly happier now than I've ever been in my life. And I feel more optimistic about humanity than almost anybody I talk to, because there is a fairly negative wave going through the world at the moment. But I do believe in rational optimism. It needs to be rational. And that I do now see that there are ways of putting something into the world to change this balance, that culturally we have permitted psychopaths, tyrants, narcissists to dominate us because of their certainty, because they tell us they know what's going on. And I think in the last 100 years, we've gone through an incredible progression from, you know, stuffing 4-year-olds up chimneys and leaving them there to die if we couldn't get them out and down the mines, from having no age of sexual consent. You know, it was 12 when it was first imposed, I think in the 1870s in this country. I think our society, you know, from the First World War, where people queued to go and kill the Bosch, to the not in my name protests of the Iraq War here, where, you know, 1 million people marched in London. I think there is a transition, and I think it needs to go further to basically say, yeah, there are these predators, and there's a way of making a society where, as Donald Trump said, there are predators and prey, and that's all you have. There are pimps and hoes, as another professional gentleman put it. That's not true.
No, that's
not true at all. And we need to dethrone the predators. We need to, and I think that the models that we work with point in that direction, you know, and open that up. But so much more needs to be done to understand this and to spread the ideas themselves.
You know, when you talk about the state of the world, and that's something that, you know, I wanted to save the world, and the youthful idealism and things that groups sell, is that you're going to transform the world, and how we're on the brink of, and in some ways, you know, we have this ability to destroy the world very easily.
End of the age of Kali Yuga.
Yeah, well, we do. I mean, you know, bombs, bang, bang, done. But when I remember talking with my grandmother, who was from Preston, and what her life was like, growing up in Preston, working in the mills when she was finished 3rd grade, where she wasn't allowed to go to the bathroom, where she wasn't allowed to take breaks. She was hit for 16-hour days. That was the norm.
Yes.
At that time. And we certainly, in that category, have improved the world, and in so many categories the world, so that I think that optimism maybe comes from talking to the people who are older than we are, who had experiences in the past that can share what life was like, because most people would not remember. I mean, I'm 64, so my grandmother, you know, died in her almost 100. So she was telling me about a time in the late 1800s that, in a real tactile way, that I can only communicate the story I just told. I can't tell it in a visceral way that you knew it was real.
Yeah, I mean, my grandmother was born, I think, in 1882. She was one of 14 children. 3 of them died in childhood, and we can stop just at that point and say, you know, before Semmelweis persuaded people that they ought to wash their hands before delivering babies, that almost any family would have the trauma of a lost child. You know, this horrifying. You know, and so, you know, I look at the cultures and the wars that have been fought. So I got very interested in the difference between British and American hippies, because it's the time we grew up in. And I knew a lot of draft dodgers as a young man who were in
What's the
Scientology.
difference?
Yeah, and in Scientology, they brought in the whole religion ministers course to stop, so that they wouldn't have to go to Vietnam. And I talked with a number of people who'd gone through the training, a 1-week course to become a Scientology minister, so they couldn't be drafted. But I think a significant difference was both of our countries were fighting wars at that time. We were fighting a war in Malaysia, but that was all kept very quiet, and we didn't have the draft. And so the British hippies grew up in a culture which was not living within a pool of post-traumatic stress disorder. Vietnam and subsequently Iraq, Afghanistan, basically have put a lot of people into the population who have PTSD. And I think, looking back over the history of humanity, if you can find cultures where war wasn't being fought, where psychopaths were not brutalizing the population, the only one I know of is the Indus Valley civilization, which survived for about 700 years without kings or priests and without warfare, showing that it can be done in the northern, the northwestern part of India. But for the most part, so the culture, the idea of the psychopath, is there a way forward where we can recognize these people and help them, rather than, putting them into a prison culture, which says, well, they deserve to be treated horribly, which is a ridiculous idea, because you're just hot housing and training these ideas. And we do now have evidence that if even the worst psychopaths are treated with compassion, they are less likely to do harm.
Some of this, I was just reflecting that some of this goes back in some strange way to business. And in the 50s, the way someone made advancement, I'll pull it back to what you were saying, I hope.
Yeah, no, I think
was engineering.
Yep.
That's the people. And then in the 60s, often the accountants, the people who were finance people. That's how people made advancement. And in the 70s, it was human potential. The idea that you could maximize someone's potential. You could get more out of your employee. And then we get into this kind of what's happened in our society, at least in America, in our politics of this Ayn Randian almost view. That 70s piece that we came in, I grew up in, of recognizing that people can improve, can be changed, trying to find models or ways of understanding the difficulties and improving them, somehow is left behind a little bit into the prison industrial complex or the military industrial complex. So there's business has its ways and drives some of this, and we don't always look at the redemption and ways of helping people, at least where I live.
And we've seen the power of the super rich. We've seen this new cast of people who've actually come about since 1980. That in 1980, the average CEO in a US company would earn about 40 times what the blue collar worker was on the production line was earning. By 2000, that was 411 times. And we're then seeing the hedge funds and these people are just ripping off huge amounts of money from the society for no return in the stock market or wherever. And that imbalance where you have this fairly small number of predatory people. And, in terms of squirrels, it's like having a squirrel that's amassed 1 trillion acorns while all around are starving, that there is something seriously bad in having a world that is governed and influenced by Bill Gates, George Soros, Bezos, Branson, whoever, frankly, where they have that much power. This should not, and I'm not a socialist, I'm not left-wing in any way. I believe in democracy. But, and I don't believe that we're anywhere near it, because the power of corporations and the power of certain individuals is too great. And I think we are recognizing that. I think there is, a groundswell, which, one end is a kind of libertarian QAnon view of we don't trust anybody. And I agree that the swamp needs to be drained. the problem is that the man they put in to drain the swamp was one of the people who'd put most of the sewage in there, and was not going to. But I think we do need a societal change, and I think I'm optimistic because I think we're on the verge of it. And that depends upon people, depends on everybody becoming the most they can be, developing themselves and taking responsibility for what they do. And ideas like Ira Chalef's courageous followership, which has now been with us for about 25 years. And, I have the great good fortune that Ira is one of my close friends, to have seen him develop this idea and say, well, you can't just blame the leaders. Let's learn how to follow. Let's make following no longer a negative concept. Let's change the way we do things. And because he's worked in business, he's worked with the military, he's lectured the FBI, he's lectured the Council of Europe. His book Intelligent Disobedience is available in Chinese and Russian. So ideas are spreading, and those, as L. Ron Hubbard said, ideas not battles mark the forward progress of mankind. I'm not sure who he stole that from, but generally did. Please put it in the comments below if you know the originator of that idea. But it's probably H.G. Wells with his Short History of the World. But it is true, and we are seeing ideas moving forward. So sexism, racism, homophobia, these are things that our attitudes have changed seriously since we were kids, and that's a really positive thing.
Yeah, that is. It's a funny world we live in.
Indeed. And I think that should be probably our concluding remark. As Alexei Sale, the great British comedian, said, "It's a funny old world." So,
all right. Well, then we're going to stop
It's such
recording.
a pleasure talking with you, John, as always.
Yeah.
I'm going to stop this recording, but I did want to.
Yeah. So thanks very much for watching, and that's us done.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.